Hello, I'm Reverend Ogun Holder coming to you from my home office, a place where I think none of us expected me to be in this moment, but such is the nature of the times we live in presently. I'll speak more to that in a moment, but first I'd like to begin with a centering affirmative prayer. So I invite you to gently close the eyes, take a deep breath, come to center, and hear the words of the scripture from 2 Timothy chapter 1. For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of sound mind. So from that place, we affirm that we are indeed the power of God manifested in, through, and as us. We are the love of God manifested in, through, and as us. And we are divine wisdom and discernment. So I'd like each of you to take a moment right now to affirm to yourself, silently or out loud, I am divine power. I am divine love. I am divine wisdom and discernment. And so it is, and so we let it be. Amen. So yesterday you would have received a notice that the Board of Trustees has decided to suspend Sunday services and events and classes for the next 2 weeks. We'll reevaluate and update you, but our intention is to resume on March 29th. This was a decision that was uneasy to come to, especially in light of an earlier notice that we posted about continuing to have services. However, as things continue to unfold in the wider world and here in the United States, and even within our local town of Amesbury, we realized that we had to revisit what it meant to be good stewards, not coming from that place of fear, but from that place of wisdom and discernment. And we realized that part of being stewards is making sure that we make decisions for the greater good of the health of our congregation and even for the wider region. So that effect, following the pattern of the advice of health authorities and other organizations and other unity churches and other communities, we are doing our part to limit the potential spread of the coronavirus by suspending gatherings. This will not be permanent, and at the same time, we're not clear how long it will need to go on for. But as I mentioned, we're setting the intention for 2 weeks, which seems to be the prevailing pattern, and with all intention to restart services Sunday, March 29th. And we will be very proactive about communicating that with you. We apologize for any inconvenience, and we know that this is a disruption to our regular lives. Had we been meeting as usual at church on Sunday morning, we would be enjoying music now, and I'd be given part 2 of my series of finding yourself in transition. And at first I was going to suspend that talk or give a pause in that talk and speak specifically to what we are going through right now. But then I realized I would be talking about the first stage of the transition process, which is endings. As I mentioned in the overview last week, which is up on YouTube, every process of transition begins with an ending. Then I realized that for many of us now, we are going through so many endings that have been imposed upon us. We are experiencing an ending of our routine of gathering in a spiritual community, of going to support meetings and different sporting events and concerts and movies and the gym. Our routine, as we've known it for some of us for decades, has suddenly come to an abrupt halt for the most part. We are in ending. And one of the things we have to remember about endings is that the feelings that come up are quite natural and quite normal and not to be feared, but rather to be embraced. As I mentioned last week, part of realizing that with endings, there's a death of some kind, and many of us, we fear death. We fear the change that comes, but in so doing, what we are also resisting is the new life and new opportunities. If you'll remember, the change makes us feel like we're in crisis. And the Chinese word for crisis is a combination of danger and opportunity. And we tend to focus on the danger a lot. And indeed, in this time with the spread of this virus, this is a time that can be dangerous for both the very young and the elderly, folks that make up a part of our congregation. So there is a legitimate, perhaps, health danger. And there's also an opportunity for us to perhaps revisit how we can be in community together. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So let's get into what happens when we are going through endings, and what comes up and what we may feel and how we can address that. So there are 4 aspects of endings that Robert Brummett talks about in his book that we are following, Finding Yourself in Transition. Again, depending on when you watch your book, your cover might not look like mine, but this is mine. And there are 4 aspects he talks about: disengagement, disidentification, disenchantment, and disorientation. So first of all, these aspects are all closely related to each other, and it's quite common to experience more than one of them at a time. So you might find yourself at this time not just with what's been happening and shifting our schedules and our routines due to the coronavirus, but maybe in your life as well, if you've been experiencing or going through an ending. On a personal note, you'll realize that this message is not streaming live. It's been pre-recorded. And you're wondering, why did Reverend Ogun choose to pre-record instead of live stream? Well, as I mentioned some weeks ago, I'm going through the ending of my relationship with my girlfriend. In fact, I think it's fair to say I'm getting into the void right now. But part of the logistics around that was she's got to move her schedule to come in at 10 a.m. on Sunday, which is, you're watching this today, probably around now, 10 a.m. So there was really no way to, at this last minute, reschedule them, and shooting a video while movers are unpacking everything around you, probably not the best scenario. So that ending, the aspects of that ending in my life is impacting what's happening now with this, and we still got to go ahead and move on with what needs to be done. So I thought it best to, while I still have a very quiet environment, to record this and ahead of time. So let's look briefly at disengagement. Disengagement means we have to disconnect with the familiar, disconnect with the things that we are used to having in our life. Some of these disconnections are intentional and we set them in motion on our own, but again, some of them are uninvited, like what we are experiencing right now. What we have to realize is this: when we have external separations, they're really symbolic of internal separations as well, because part of what this process of transition and change happens really internally, but they are instigated from outside events and happenings. Changes happen on the outside, and they force us to relook at things inside. So we have to become disengaged. Right now, disengage. And right now, we might be uncomfortable with that. We are uncomfortable with maybe not coming to church as usual on Sunday morning and how that may look. So part of this is feeling that out and being accustomed to that. But however, when we disengage and disconnect from the usual routines, doesn't mean we don't find new ones. For example, even though we may not come to church and gather, does not mean we do not connect with others. So part of what I'd like to invite you to do this week is think of the people who you might usually talk to when you come to church on Sunday, and see if you have their phone numbers. And when you're done watching this, call them up. Check in. How are you doing? What's it like not coming to church? Weird, right? Or if you're a regular live streamer and you happen to know the phone numbers of some other people, call them and give them a word of support. As a regular live streamer, you're going to be okay. So find ways to connect with other people through technology, through your phone, through Skype, Zoom, however it is, and give each other support. This is how divine love manifests between each and every one of us. The next stage is disidentification. And this is primarily an internal part of the process. This is where we realize that we have formed our identity by the roles that we play. And when those roles or events come to an end, who are we without them? For many of us, attending Sunday service is an established part of who we are. Being in a spiritual community physically is part of what makes us who we are. Who are we without that? That question may come up. Our community is looking at the bigger picture of selling our property. Who are we going to be without coming to that location? We're still going to exist, of course, and we will be in a new location eventually, but many of us may not realize how much we identified with being at that location or meeting every Sunday until the opportunity to not do it comes up. So like I said, changes on the outside often invite us to look at changes on the inside. The next phase, disenchantment. Disenchantment is that sort of feeling of, when the bottom drops out, because as changes happen, it causes us to question our beliefs and the things we trusted. It's a little different than disappointment. And I love the analogy Robert Brummett uses in the book. Disappointment is like when we were kids and we realized the store Santa Claus, he wasn't the real Santa. He was just a guy with the fake beard on. But we believed there was a Santa Claus. That's disappointment. Disenchantment is when we realized there is no Santa Claus. We've experienced this in our spiritual transformation as well. When we go through spiritual crisis, for example, we held certain beliefs about what God was, the old man in the sky. We're talking about this in our prayer class right now, how many of us still identify God as the bodyguard, the one who's looking out for us. And then we realize that no, we are the presence of the divine. We are the God looking out for us. We are the God loving each other. That there's no separate entity doing this, and it kind of stirs everything up and upends everything. This is what disenchantment is. It forces us to look at those embedded beliefs that we've been holding on to. So perhaps now in the midst of this coronavirus, you might feel disenchanted about government leadership and think they failed us. You might even feel disenchanted about us deciding not to have services at our church and might think we're given into fear. And I'd like to reiterate, there's a difference between giving into fear and panic and making choices from faith and presence and good stewardship, which is where we made our choices from. And finally, there is disorientation. This results from when we dismantle the old self, the old life, the old reality we used to experience. And in a sense, we don't just lose our way, we kind of lose a sense of where we were going in the first place. And some of us may feel disoriented during this time of the coronavirus, when we need to self-quarantine and events and gatherings and things are canceled. Like, where do we go from here? And again, it's a perfectly natural place to feel. We ask ourselves, what do I do now? Again, perfect questions to come up. But this is where it's really important to remember who we are as spiritual beings, who we are as a spiritual community, our spiritual truths, which is simply this: nothing outside is the source of our guidance. Nothing outside is the source of who we are, who we identify as. It all starts from within. It all starts from our divine identity. And it's interesting that this might be a time for us, as we either self-quarantine or forced quarantine, to be with ourselves, to really look within and ask ourselves a deeper question of, now that I am without all these routines in my life, now that I'm without all the go-tos, how much of myself did I really identify and define myself with them? I'll encourage us to take advantage of this time when, for the greater good and health of all, we keep our distance and self-isolate. Use this as a time not of self-isolation to panic and boredom, but a time of self-isolation for meditation, for discernment, for turning deeper within, centering in that the truth that we are divine power and divine love and divine wisdom. We have to remember that the circumstances around us and even the circumstances in our physical body do not define the wholeness of who we are. We are not spiritual community simply because we gather in a fixed location on a regular basis. We are a spiritual community because there's a group of us who believe together, who love each other together, and yes, who can still stay connected together during this time. So I invite you to, as you examine these feelings that come up during this time, during this ending of your normal routine and life as you may know it, to see it again as that opportunity for being in a place of solitude, peace, dedicating yourselves to a mindful practice during this time. Be faith and presence, not fear and panic. Be the peace and the calm in the midst of the storm. Rest in the certainty that this too will pass, and that as a spiritual community, we are strong together. So I want to invite us at this time to turn within for a period of meditation. For a few more moments, let's just take some deep breaths and center in to our heart space as best we can. Wherever you are right now, as long as it's safe, gently close the eyes and allow the mind to follow the flow of the breath. Follow the breath as it flows in and out, giving gratitude for the ability right now to take a deep breath. Gratitude for this body and the wholeness that is the source of our health. Blessing this body, knowing that in this moment as this virus spreads, regardless of if it touches us or not, we are whole, we are strong, and who we are at this time will not be defined by any illness. We are the embodiment of the divine. We are the embodiment of all that is. And as we continue to center in, we give further thanks that in the midst of these circumstances, we know there is a deeper truth. We know that deeper truth is that the divine is the source of all. All that God is, we are. I invite you to affirm that with me now. All that God is, I am. All that God is, I am. All that God is, I am. I am the presence of peace. I am the presence of wholeness. I am the presence of divine love. All that God is, I am. So as we sit for a few moments in the silence, we ground ourselves in that truth. Regardless of the circumstances around us, all that God is, I am. And so it is. Thank you for watching today. I'd like to remind you to click on the donate button on our website, or if you've got text to give set up, to please continue during this time that we're not meeting to make your donations. This might even be a good time to consider stepping up donations because, as you know, there are still certain expenses that we will need to continue to account for, least of which is the mortgage on our building, um, staff that still needs to keep some basic administrative things going. And let's also remember that Unity on the River, we give a portion of what we receive to community organizations that serve those in need. And I get the feeling that during this time, those organizations are probably going to be taxed a little bit more to serve others. So thank you for your donations. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for connecting with each other during this time. Make those phone calls, send those emails, connect on on social media with each other, and continue to be the spiritual community that you are. I'll talk to you soon. Namaste.